Jerusalem was the old city. There was almost nothing outside the walls of the old city. So when historians, when religious writers focus on Jerusalem, almost always there's a recognition that this is the ultimate piece of real estate. It's only about 250 acres with 4 kilometers of walls, and yet so many of the holy sites that are very, very crucial in Judaism are either within the walls of the old city or just outside the walls. Similarly, the most holy sites in Islam are located within the walls of the old city, more specifically in the area referred to as the Temple Mount.
Now, these are clearly marked as the Muslim corridor, the Christian corridor, the Armenian, the Jewish, and of course the Temple Mount. They're very definite the way they're marked. Is this how it actually is, an actual fact, or is this just an academic rendition of what was meant to be?
Well, historically, that's the way the corridors are known.
Yes.
However, there's been encroachment over the last decades. There are Jewish people living in some of the Christian quarter
and these, of course, refer to the demographics.
Well, they refer more to history.
Yes.
Because, in fact, right now, parts of the Christian quarter are inhabited by Muslim Palestinians, and so, but they're still known when you visit the old city as under these designations, under these names.
Okay, very interesting. And there's another document that Dr. Gautier has prepared here, and it's entitled "The Claims of the Zionist Organization Include Some Conditions." Now, I know that there's a lot of debate surrounding the whole Zionist movement, so just saying that name alone elicits reaction in many people, but we're going to get to that after the break. Don't go away. Hello again, and welcome back to our examination of who owns Jerusalem today. Dr. Jaques Gautier is with me. He's an international lawyer and an academic who has studied this for over 20 years. Now, once again, our lines are open for your questions or your comments, and we don't expect you to function at the level of Dr. Gautier, who is giving us his research over the past 20 years on who actually owns Jerusalem. So feel free to call in at any time with any of your questions or your comments, and don't be shy. Now, Dr. Gautier, before we move on here, because there's something very significant about the Balfour Declaration, but before we do that, the father of the modern-day Zionist movement, who is this? That bears a significance.
Okay, it's important to understand, as I direct you to the moment in history which made all the difference from a legal point of view, to understand the background. In the late part of the 19th century, Theodor Herzl, published a thesis in 1896 in which he argued that the solution to the problems faced by the Jewish people over many centuries was the establishment of a Jewish state.
Yes.
After he published his thesis, he was the one that was behind the organization of a very crucial conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. And that's where a plan of action was designed for the Jewish people, led by this new organization, the Zionist organization. And it is their position that was ultimately presented in Paris at the Peace Conference in 1919, early 1919. Prior to that, in 1917, the Balfour Declaration of the British War Cabinet had been a very significant action, a very significant step in the evolution of the Zionist movement, because one government, and it was the British government, very powerful leaders during the war, that issued this declaration, which does not result in rights internationally binding on other nations, but it certainly was a commitment by the British government to help the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine.
You see, I want to stop you for one moment here, because this is where we're still seeing the fallout to this day with that area known as Palestine. Because this Balfour Declaration virtually established Palestine as a territory, as a national home for the Jewish people. And we're still seeing that controversy going on today.
Okay. It did not establish it. It was an expression of support by the British authorities in regard to something that the Zionist movement wanted to do at a time when the whole world was at war. eventually, the turning point is the Paris Peace Conference. For 6 months, leaders of what was referred to as the principal Allied powers and many other nations met at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris and tried to make decisions on what to do with the territories of the nations who had lost the war in Europe and the Turks, the Ottomans in the Middle East.
Right.
This is where, when you study the history, you will find the most crucial facts. At this conference, and if we can turn to the board, you will see that the Zionist organization was one of the claimants. And in our legal system, people are familiar with a statement of claim. When you present a claim in a courtroom, the claim itself is not binding on anyone unless your arguments are recognized by the judges, unless they take your arguments and say, we agree, we recognize, it's now law. And this is what happens as a result of the events in Paris. The Zionist organization is asking those nations with the power to decide on the future of certain territories to recognize the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine and the right for the Jews to reconstitute their national home there. Same conference, an Arab delegation led by Faisal, the most powerful tribe in the Middle East in those days was the Hashemite tribe. And he presented a claim to have one large independent Arab state created out of the territories of the defeated Turks. So the question becomes, what was the response of the nations, of the 5 countries, in fact, referred to as the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers? Did they accept or reject the claims presented by the Zionist organization, by the Arab people? During the Paris Peace Conference emerged a very important document, treaty, the Covenant of the League of Nations. And I can't get into the details, but in Article 22 of that covenant, which is the board that you have before you now, a new system was introduced. And they referred to that system as involving a sacred trust of mankind on behalf of certain peoples who were not yet ready to take over territories. And it becomes very important. This is one of the pillars of the legal arguments which I have been presenting.
And that takes us now to San Remo.
It takes us to San Remo, and I quickly must explain to you the tremendous importance of the San Remo conference that took place in 1920. As a result of all the deliberations and arguments in Paris for 6 months, the first 6 months of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles emerged. And decisions were made on what to do with territories of Europe, which chunks to take away from the Germans and their allies and give to others. But decisions were not made concerning the Ottoman territories.
Yes, of the Middle East.
Yeah, they heard the arguments and the presentations and the claims of the Zionist organization, of the Arabs, who incidentally were not disagreeing with each other in Paris. In fact, there was a treaty signed between Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist organization, and Faisal, the leader of the Arabs, in which they said they would support each other's claims. So we get to St. Remo, and the purpose of St. Remo was for the leaders to gather to deliberate on what to do with what they heard in Paris. And this is where the legal issue is tackled. This is where judgment is rendered, which I contend is still relevant today. Now, you should know that at that meeting, put this board up, the leaders of the most significant nations, the Supreme Councils, gathered, and I have a picture that I was able to obtain while I visited the villa in St. Remo. The villa that was before you a moment ago is called the Villa de Vachon, and the leaders met in this room, and that was the Supreme Council. They met in the 4 chairs at the end representing the 5 key nations, the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Japan. And you see here on the steps of the villa these leaders. And what do they decide? They make a decision taking the principles of the Balfour Declaration, to establish, number one, in Palestine, a Jewish home.